Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus and his disciples left the synagogue at Capernaum and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door, and he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still dark, he got up and went out to the deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. So I have to confess that this gospel for today hit me right between the eyes, and I will get back to why that is. But first, a little bit about what's happening. We're still in that first chapter of Mark. Remember, the Gospel of Mark runs full speed through the story, and it doesn't start with the birth narrative like some of the later Gospels. It starts with John the Baptist heralding what is to come, goes straight into the baptism of Jesus. The baptism story is almost told when immediately he's thrust out into the wilderness, where he prays for 40 days, where he's tempted, where he prepares for the ministry at hand, where he takes the time to fill himself with a sense of God's purpose guiding his life, where he empties himself of his own ambition, his own self-preservation, all of the things that he would love God to say he was called to do, so he could be filled with what God truly asked him. And then as soon as that ends, he calls his followers, they gather, and then they go into the synagogue, like we heard last Sunday. They go into the synagogue, and he casts out demons, and he tells them not to tell anybody, and then we get to today. Today's story starts with them returning to Peter's house, the house of Peter and Andrew, and we find out something important. We find out that his mother-in-law is there. And because I'm an incredibly skilled detective, I have ascertained that if Peter's mother-in-law was at the house, that Peter might have been married. It's my great knowledge of Greek that led to that. But there's more to it. Not only is Peter married and possibly has children, but we know that if his mother-in-law is living at his house, that a few other things are also true. We know that that means that Peter's mother-in-law probably is widowed, or else she would live with her husband. We also know by this that there are no sons, because the first place that a mother-in-law would go would be to her own son's house, because that's who's supposed to take care of her. And then after the sons aren't there, you would go to the next of kin. So we know by the fact that she lives with Peter, that Peter's not only married, but is the only caretaker for his mother-in-law. And we know that when Jesus calls Peter to serve, that means that he had to drop not just his net, but his obligation to his family, his mother-in-law, possibly his children. And then we can assume, because of the way society was then, you didn't date for a long time until you found the perfect soulmate, go on Match.com, whatever other means to find that love of your life. It was arranged from a young age who you were going to marry, and if you were a man of a certain age, you would be married. So we can assume, and this is sometimes something we don't assume, that those 12 followers that dropped everything and followed Jesus had huge obligations at home. But they did, and they followed Jesus. So back to the story. We are in Peter and Andrew's house, and Jesus is there, and the mother-in-law has a fever, and it's not like the fever that has gotten at least most of the households this winter. This is a fever in which, in that day and age, odds are he didn't recover. And especially at her age. But Jesus goes in. And as Jesus usually does, he doesn't just cure, he heals. And he takes her hand. And he lifts her up. Physically and metaphorically. And he heals her. And what's the first thing the mother-in-law does when she's healed? She starts serving everybody around. But we do get a sense in that moment that maybe Jesus realizes the magnitude of what he's asking of all of us, certainly of those 12 followers, and of their families. And he realizes how convenient staying there would be. He's well received. His followers have families and attachments. So what's the first thing he does? He goes out into the wilderness and he prays. And then we hear that they're looking frantically for him, and they say when they find him, everybody is looking for you. Everybody is trying to pull on your cloak. Everybody has something they need from you. Why are you here praying when there's so much to be done? It's when Jesus says, it's time for us to go. It's funny, I talked to the third grade class. I go into their class once a month to teach a class, and we were talking about the Gospels, and the answer I was shooting for was parables. And when you ask children questions, their first default answer is Jesus, no matter what the question is. But if Jesus is in the question, then you have to figure out what's next. So my question to him was, how does Jesus teach people? And if I asked adults, I'm sure I might get his sermons, maybe the parables, that's what I was looking for, maybe his teachings. The first answer from the third grade was his prayers. Now, whether that's sort of default to after Jesus, God, and his prayer, I'm not sure. But then I asked my daughter and son at the kitchen table, I said, how did Jesus teach people? When they're asking what I talked to the class about, because Elliot was absent that day. And Laura Lee says prayer. But you know what? Maybe that's true. Maybe we learn, or should learn, far more about Jesus from his prayer than we do. Jesus starts his whole ministry by 40 days of prayer. And then as soon as he gets out and he realizes how tantalizing it is, he realizes how much he's asking of people, he realizes how much easier it would be to stay, he realizes how easy it is to get filled up with everything else. Before he heads out, he goes and he prays again. And this is where it hit me right between the eyes. I'm pretty good at doing. And this church is very good at doing. I am so proud, as you heard from our State of the Parish address, and all of the things that we've done over the last 2 years. I set out with some lofty goals, and I'm amazed at the way the parish has risen in programming, in giving, in service. I am absolutely excited. But there's also the other piece. We have to pray. We have to be filled. We have to let the doing sit idly by, even though everybody is pulling at us, and say, you know what? It's God's work we're doing. We can't get there without opening ourselves up to prayer. As we're talking about our vestry retreat, last year I worked the vestry to the nines. We had work sessions. We had 3 or 4 foci of ministry that needed to be done, and we need to get into task groups to figure out how to get that done, and we did a huge and amazing job. But we decided this year, we need to pray together. We need to learn more about each other. We need a retreat to be a retreat. And I realize in my own life, I need the same thing. professional part of it, I never recouped after Christmas. I ran through Christmas and then with funerals and guests and not taking any days off. I realized I went straight through, and I found myself in meetings, and instead of being that non-anxious presence, instead of being that peace, I've been a source of anxiety. I've been shooting from the hip more than I usually am. I've been more irritable than normal. And I realize that my balance is off. And I've even, as my days get busier, and I have the same number of hours as everybody else, and it's not a matter of not having enough time, it's a matter of how I make my decisions with the time that I do have, and cutting away some of the disciplines that give me a sense of God working in my life, filling it with the busyness, the doing. I remember a week before last sitting at that Taizé service where I had no responsibility whatsoever besides just sitting there. I didn't even have to respond. It was just a service of music and 10 minutes of silence and candles and beautiful prayers washing over, that I could just be still for 30 some odd minutes, and I realized how desperately I needed it. I could have sat for days just sitting there in that silence. And so many of us, we get busy doing and we forget about that. So we do learn from Jesus' sermons, we do learn from the parables, but as the children remind us, we learn from his prayer. We need to be vessels of God. So we need to be filled with God. And as we approach Lent, I invite you, find out where your life is out of balance. Where do you need to be recalibrated? If it's exercise that allows you to have that time with God, if it's silent meditation, if it's prayer, whatever it is, to get your life in balance so that you can be filled with God and you can be free to spread that, be ambassadors of that, to listen carefully and have the strength to follow. Whatever it takes, whatever has you leaning a little bit this way, ask yourself, what would it take you to get to that place where you're open to God, calling you, guiding you, and filling you in life? You have 10 days